everyone present here to kindly mute their mics and cameras. And there will be an Q&A session in which you can raise your hand in the Google Meet and pose the question directly to the speaker. So today we have Professor Vipul Singh as the speaker for this lecture. But before we go into that, let me first briefly introduce our speaker. Professor Vipul Singh is a professor at Department of History, University of Delhi, and has over 20 years of teaching and research experience. He is alumnus Carson Fellow of the Rachel Carson Center, Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich, an environmental historian trained in early modern Indian history. His major area of focus has been ecologically harsh zones of India, such as arid western Rajasthan and plains of the Ganga and the Indian Ocean world. His most recent publications include a book titled Speaking Rivers: Environmental History of a Mid-Ganga Flood Country and research papers titled Cyclones, Shipwrecks, and Environmental Anxiety: British Rule and Ecological Change in the Andaman Islands 1718s to 1900s, Global Environment and Governing Fluvial Commons in Colonial Bihar, Alluvion and Diluvion Regulation and Decommunization. He is currently working on a book project on the effects of global climate change and oceanic circulation in early modern India. Today, he will be delivering his lecture on the age of global climate anomaly and the Mughal state. I would like to invite Mrs. Neeru ma'am to share some few words with us.
Good afternoon, Professor Vipul Singh. Welcome to our college. It's
Thank
a
you.
pleasure and an honor to have you. Our students are very familiar with you through the book, but now today they'll get an opportunity to hear you also. So we are looking forward to a very engaging session with you. Welcome once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for these words. So you may begin with your lecture. Thank you so much.
So many thanks, Ujjwal and Dr. Neeru, for all kind words and generous introduction that you gave. In these trying times for the humans, first of all, let me thank the History Society and the faculty of this Department of DCAC, particularly Dr. Neeru El Abadi, Dr. Anil Chauhan, Dr. Basra, and then Dr. Shudha Sharma, Dr. O.P. Singh, and all other members. I know that it's a huge department. So I thank everyone for inviting me for this talk. And thanks to all our lovely students who have taken out time in this difficult time to listen to my conversation. Let me tell you that I have an old association with this college. I was, in fact, part of the innovation project that your college was awarded by the University of Delhi in 2013. So despite my prolonged struggle with health and other issues, I decided to interact with you because I just couldn't say no to the request of Dr. O.P. Singh, such a disciplined teacher he is. You all know him better. Beyond that, there are certain people in your academic fraternity whom you can't say no. He has been by my side in good and bad times. So here you are. I'm in front of you. I readily agreed to his request for such a prestigious event of Delhi College of Arts and Commerce History Association. Now, allow me to begin my talk with an anecdote. Let me share a few slides with you. Ujjwal, you've given permission to share?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, all of us have read this parable of a group of blind men and the elephant. They had never come across an elephant before, and so when each of them, they tried to know what the elephant is like, so they started touching the elephant. Now each blind man feels a different part of the elephant's body. So what happens that naturally their description of the elephant would be different from each other, and that's why they describe the elephant in a different way. The fact remains that the elephant is an animal, a huge animal, but the description is given by all these friends differently. Now, history writing is like this. Each of the historian would tell you a different story of the same fact. And that is why, history, we say that is such a vibrant discipline, and, it keeps on progressing every day. So every new historian would come with a new story. In fact, if you look at the other slide, it's just a minute. So if you look at this other slide here, it's a slide which is of a different version of a parable. So I have this alternate version of the parable that I just mentioned. There was a drunk man who has lost the key of his car in a dark night, right? Now he searches for the key beneath the lamppost, and he does so not because it was here that he had lost it. Why he's looking for the key just beneath the lamppost? Because it was here that he has found the light. So as history researchers, what we have done, we have been doing the same thing. We have been writing histories based on such sources which are easily accessible to us. I mean, when I say that, what are these easily accessible sources? All the written documents that we find of any period of history. So the documents of human archives I'm talking about. But if we really want to find the lost key, we have to go into the darkness, because the key is actually in the darkness. So the darkness I'm talking about is the discipline with which we have not been familiar. We need to look for evidences which different other disciplines, just different from social sciences, especially sciences. We have to take help from the sciences, and science has offered before us many of the informations. So we have to go beyond these conventional sources that we as historians have been using. So my talk today tries to sensitize you to this unexplored and these unsung sources. And as my title says, the global climate anomaly and the Mughal Rule, it might sound like such an absurd idea, because I'm saying so because the mainstream historiography on the Mughal history often projects 17th century or maybe the 16th century as the pinnacle of the Mughal rule, and it is illustrated as a sort of an exceedingly tight-knit and bureaucratically very robust kind of a state. So it's a blooming empire that we know about the Mughal state. Now, I, on the contrary, am trying to tell you a story of an aberration of sort. Now, that's something which might surprise you, but let me give you a sense of what my story is all about. Climate actually played a very key role in the course of human history, not only in India, but also in different parts of the world. And especially if you look at the 17th century, Europe has been one area on which there has been a lot of research. It has been well established through various historical and scientific evidences that climate has actually played some role in the 17th century Europe. Now, the hardcore historical and the corroborative evidences, they indicate that the sun the shining sun, as a matter of fact, went through a period of inactivity, actually, in the later half of the 17th century.
Hello, hello.
Yes? Are you not able to hear me? Somebody said hello.
No, sir, we can hear you. I think there was some problem there.
Okay. So to tell you a more precise date, this kind of a sun going into inactivity that I'm talking about, it happened between 1645 and 1715. Now, in contrast to the European situation, the Mughal state arguably thrived during this same period. And many would say that it was the crescendo, kind of a high point of the Mughal Empire. And the Mughals actually reached the territorial maximum. So they moved in deep into the south, they went to western part of India. So they expanded in a big way during the 17th century. So does it mean that India did not experience any kind of a climate variation during this phase of global climate anomaly that I'm talking about? Now, how did it affect the Indian agriculture? This is one other question that might come in our discussion. What impact did it have on the policy of the Mughals? So was there an effect on the treasury of the Mughals? Because agriculture, it has been based on Indian monsoon for time immemorial. So what measures were taken by the rulers when you have some kind of climate-induced situations? Now, these are a few of the questions that I intend to unfold before you. And as I mentioned, climate as an important aspect of the 17th century. Let me first tell you that why at all climate matters to us as history researchers. Now, during your early years of learning in school, many of you, even I was told about this, so you must have been made to believe by your teachers that many million years ago the earth was very warm, isn't it? So it was so warm that even no living things could survive. So your teacher must have told you that if there was lesser carbon dioxide, the Earth's surface would have been covered with ice sheet. You remember this? Now, at that small age, you may not have been able to connect as to how or we came to this age when we are living on the Earth and the population is growing. But the Earth became full of life all around after many years. In fact, in many years ago, this planet Earth, yesterday only we have celebrated the Earth Day, 22nd April. So the planet Earth was very warm, and it was warm because it was full of rich carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, but this combination of heat and carbon dioxide actually led to gradual vegetation. And these vegetation, when I'm saying vegetation, this included the forest, the mangroves that we find on the seacoast. And this led to decrease in the level of carbon dioxide because all these plants and the mangroves absorb the carbon. Now, another very interesting natural formation was the coral reefs. We call this, in environment terms, we call these carbon sinks. So these coral reefs, when they were formed, they acted as reservoir for the carbon. And these coral reefs also reduce the level of carbon from this atmosphere. Now, all these factors together, the vegetation, the coral reefs, and the formations, these led to gradual cooling of the planet, and then it became livable. So this happened because the carbon dioxide blanket became thinner in the atmosphere. Now, for the same reason, today we talk about that how deforestation is causing problems for the world, for the planet. It's causing anxiety around the world because we talk about cutting of the forests and the trees, and we say that these trees, when we cut the trees, they release carbon in the atmosphere. Because if the tree is a living tree, it absorbs the carbon, but when you cut the tree, it will release the carbon in the atmosphere. So what happens that when you do the cutting of the forest, there will be sudden increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Now this will lead to major change, and these changes will happen it will lead to changes in the climate as well. Now, today what we are doing, we are burning a lot of fossil fuels. We release huge quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through different machines that we have been using. And of course, we are also cutting the forest in all parts of the world. Now, at the same time, when all these things are happening, we call this as an Anthropocene phenomena because it's all something that the humans are doing. So, the Earth's capacity to absorb the carbon dioxide has decreased. So, what is happening now? That you have a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and the Earth's temperature is increasing today. So why I'm trying to explain you this connection between carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature? The reason is that in past, such phenomena led to drastic changes in historical events. And one such transformation was the global cooling of the Earth's temperature in the 17th century, what is famously known as the Little Ice Age. So it was an age of climate anomaly. Now, one of the leading astronomers of the late 17th century actually recorded these absence of sunspots. When we say sunspot actually is in kind of an activity that happens in the sun. So there was a complete absence of sunspots between the period that I just mentioned, 1645 to 1715, what is also known as the Maunder minimum, the absence of sunspots. Now, this absence of sunspots was known as Maunder minimum, and it was named as Maunder minimum after one of the British astronomers whose name was Maunder. So he was the one who discovered this dearth of sunspots that during this period of the 17th century. Now, sunspots during those years were seen with naked eye, and at that time you don't have modern devices like today, but at that time they watched the sun with naked eye by projecting its image on the plain sheet. And history has all these records of the Maunder minimum. So we have records of different astronomers, like one of the famous astronomers of the time was Avelius, who observed the sun at that time. So we have evidences, archival evidences to suggest that there was actually, people were observing that the sun has gone into inactivity, and this has led to, when there is an inactivity of the sun, obviously the warmth released by the sun would be lesser. So during this Maunder minimum phase, the shining corona that which is actually visible nowadays during every solar eclipse, it had disappeared. Now, this description by the astronomers for the 17th century, they mentioned that there was a dull light. The sun had become, the ring has become not that much, it's not that much shining. It has become a kind of a dull light. It has become narrow. And so, the corona that is normally formed during the solar eclipse is not so bright during those years of 17th century. So what I'm trying to suggest that all these evidences from 17th century, the documents from the 17th century suggest that the energy of the sun appeared to have diminished. Now, it is a condition normally associated with reduced surface temperature and extreme climate events on Earth. Now, during the last 2 decades, there has been a deluge of research on this kind of 17th century environment history, and they use not only the traditional historical sources and records, but they also study the changes in the climate, the changes that has happened in water, forest, and even diseases. Now, among such nature aspect studies, research on climate histories have largely been dominated by, earth and climate scientists. And one of the very famous scientists who has worked on the climate history of the 17th century is John Eddy. Eddy actually collected numerous information from historical accounts to prove that 17th century was a period of little ice age. And he's the one who had actually popularized this name, Maunder Minimum. So the Maunder Minimum name became popular after Eddy wrote a very interesting article about the 17th century. Now, Eddy actually corroborated these 70 years period, 1645 to 1715, with minimum sunspots after a very thorough analysis of all the available records of solar activity. In fact, if you read his article, and if you look at the sources that he has used, he has included the records of the sun, the sunspot observations by astronomers. In fact, he has also used the carbon-14 record of the tree rings. Now, all these records he has used to prove that there was actually inactivity of the sun and the temperature of the earth became cooler. Now, today we are talking about the warmthness of the earth. We talk about the global warming because there is so much release of carbon. Now, in 17th century, the reverse was happening. There was lesser carbon in the atmosphere. The sun has the release of the warmth that was released by the sun. It has got reduced, and this had led to the little ice age in European history. Now, during this coldest phase of the little ice age, there are indications that the average winter temperature in Europe and North America was some kind of lesser, 2 degrees centigrade lesser than the present temperature that we find in Europe. So the entire northern hemisphere, particularly Europe, India is also part of the northern hemisphere, mind you. So the entire northern hemisphere, and especially Europe, this experienced winters of very extreme severity. It was very severe. And what happens in Europe, it was much felt because when you have severe winter, the summer also became cooler. All right. So the winter period extended, and the summer period, the months of the summer actually got decreased. So, and in fact, there are records which suggest that the summers were often very cool. And it was not only cool, it was also wet. So what has happened that when this kind of a phenomena is taking place for many years, for 70 years, it has led to the shortening of agricultural months in Europe, which led to 17th century crisis. So we know that there are many historians who've talked about 17th century crisis in different other terms. But this is also one of the important factors behind the 17th century crisis. So climate was an important actually factor which has been well researched and which has been proposed to be one of the important factors in the 17th century crisis that we have been reading a lot. Now, there is one historian, his name is Jeffrey Parker. He looked at this Maunder minimum phenomena, the global cooling phenomena in a global perspective. So if you read his book, a very interesting book, Global Crisis, he blames the 17th century cooling for the catastrophe around the world. And when he mentions all this, he also mentions about India. So, and not only India, he's also about he's also mentioning about Southeast Asia. He's talking about America. So he's talking about different parts of the world, and he says that 17th century was a period when there was crisis all around. He talks about the global crisis all around the world because of the 17th century climate changes. Now, his major argument if you look at the book, it's a very thick book, but then the major argument that comes from, that I have derived from his book, is that the cooler condition actually led to led to different kinds of crop failures all around the globe. And he says that there was also, failure of the states because of because of this lesser revenue coming to the states. Now, there were increased, he also mentions about the increased levels of wars during those times. Now, when he's talking about these wars, he's given different examples from different parts of the world. Obviously, 17th century is a period when you find that different parts of the globe actually experience wars all around. Recently, there is another environmental historian. His name is Dagmar Degroot. He has written a very interesting book. It was published just a year ago. It's called The Frigid Golden Age. And Degroot is although very against such kind of sweeping generalizations that this man Jeffrey Parker has done. And he says that this kind of generalizations cannot be done for the entire globe, and he's quite right. In fact, he thinks that the implications, the economic implications of Ice Age were very complex. Now, he's very right. If you read his book, he's although not talking about other parts of the globe, his work is confined to the Dutch Republic. But he mentions a few points that, Dutch Republic, why Dutch Republic prospered, whereas the other European countries were not, prospering. They were facing crisis. So he's saying that, there cannot be, the climate changes cannot be the reason for the crisis all around. So the different parts of the world would have different implications. Now, obviously, the most staggering example for me, the kind of a contrasting implications that the 17th century climate anomaly could have is that of the Mughals. So if we read the history of the Mughals, and obviously when we read the history of the Mughals, taking into account the varied sources, we realize that the human history is not actually exempt from natural constraints. In fact, the phenomena like climate changes can have very, unequal consequences for different societies. It can harm different societies in different ways, and it can lead to some time for resource exploitations. So it's not necessary that if there is a climate change, there'll be crisis only. The state would act differently. So all these, when we say all this, obviously for the Mughal state, for example, you need, which is such a huge bureaucratic state that we know about, which had a huge strong army. So in order to survive and sustain this kind of a bureaucracy and army, it needed huge amount of resources. Now, for the Mughals, if at all they were faced with this kind of a climate challenge, now what do they do? Do they confine themselves only to the territory that they have? Now, that's one of the questions that I faced when I'm still researching on this subject. But I faced with these questions when I looked at the Mughal history. So that is why, while many of the European nations underwent a phase of major crisis during Little Ice Age, within Europe itself, the Dutch Republic, as I just mentioned, that Degroot says that the Dutch Republic was an exceptional case. It rather thrived in the 17th century. Now, why this has happened? This has happened not because it was rich. It has happened because much of its wealth was actually derived from the activities that climate change actually benefited. Now, while we actually talk about the climate anomaly as an important influence in the course of human history, we are not actually arguing in favor of any sort of environmental determinism. So you may say that if I always emphasize on climate changes as an important factor in human history, you may say that you are talking about environmental determinism. I'm not suggesting that the environment of the past fully determined the human history. It's not true. Environment can never determine human history. Otherwise, the environmental changes around the globe would have same implication all around the globe. But this has never happened. So the fact is that the relationship between climate change and human activity is very complex, and it is actually counterintuitive. So it's actually, why I'm saying it's counterintuitive, because it's actually very contrary to our common sense expectations. We think we are today talking about global warming. We think that the global warming would always lead to disasters for all parts of the world. It may not be true, because different nations would act differently after they face this challenge. So what I believe is that the climate change could have different influence on the course of history for different nations. And it is so because humans from different geographical regions would not only face different natural conditions, but they would also react differently. For instance, weather shaped the history of the Dutch in the 17th century, as I mentioned. Like different parts of Europe, Dutch also faced the same kind of weather situations. They also faced the Little Ice Age. So the climate changes certainly presented a challenge for the Dutch citizens, but it also opened opportunities for the merchants, the sailors, to go beyond the Dutch area. So it forced actually the Dutch to venture into the Indian Ocean for their mercantile activities. That's why you see that in the Indian Ocean, the Dutch activity has suddenly increased in the 17th century. In fact, unlike other European countries, the Dutch did not rely on domestic agricultural production for its prosperity. Now, that's the difference that we find in different, the way different European nations have reacted to the climate challenge. So the different European nations tried to sustain themselves through their agricultural prosperity. So they failed in the 17th century. But the Dutch, they went outside. And they went outside, ventured into the Indian Ocean, and they started the mercantile activities. So the changing climate of the 17th century influenced the transportation networks that we find in the 17th century, and it's helped in sustaining the Dutch trading empire. So whether in the cooler climates, actually, it's not that this kind of a cooling of the climate had helped all the other European nations. It's only the Dutch who have benefited, because the weather in the cooler climates actually quickened the journey of departing ships. So, even the slight changes, when I say that, even if you say that 0.5 degrees centigrade temperature would increase, it can have diverse impacts. And it can have sort of disproportionate consequences for the society at large. So the Little Ice Age actually also coincides with the maritime expansion of Europe in the Indian Ocean and the creation of the colonial empires. So then you find that different other colonial empires also prospered. So there was some kind of a conflict between these colonial empires for the dominance of the Indian Ocean. Now the question arises that if so the question is that if Little Ice Age was truly it's a well-researched phenomena, it has been proved that this phenomena has happened, but was it truly a global phenomenon? Because Jeffrey Parker, he has touched upon this incidence of droughts in different parts of India, China, Japan, different parts of the world. But if you read his book, it's just a broad brush account. As part of historical research, it's very interesting to investigate this kind of a climate anomaly that it could have an impact in India. So the question that comes before us, that did it have a similar impact on the tropical regions like India, or for that matter any other South Asian region? So we have ocean currents, we have oceanic condensations, there are changes in the monsoon patterns in the Indian Oceans. Now, they lead to succession of different climate events. And today we read about the El Nino phenomena, the La Nina phenomena, all these oceanic activities, and it has been proved that these affect the Indian monsoons. Now, was this not happening in the 17th century? So when we talk about India, the Indian monsoon has been the backbone of Indian agriculture. For the Mughals also, it was one of the main source of their revenue. Now, and obviously, the one oceanic phenomena that has major implications on the Indian monsoon is the El Nino phenomena. And today it has been proved by the geographers and many scientists also that El Nino has been detrimental to the Indian agriculture because it disturbs the Indian monsoon. So there is lesser rainfall taking place when there is an El Nino phenomena. Now, in the early 17th century, or in the 17th century, there were many El Nino episodes, and this has been proven by different scientists through different, they have a different way of doing interpretation for those periods. So they have used different logbooks, the descriptions given by the moving ships in the oceans. And they say that in the 17th century, there were twice as many El Nino episodes. So let me tell you a bit about this El Nino. It is an episode when unusually warm ocean conditions arise along the tropical western coast of South America. Now, see, this entire ocean is connected to each other. We should not forget that. So when there is a phenomena happening in the very western coast of South America, it can have an implication in Indian Ocean as well. So it is a phenomena of rise in the surface temperature of the Pacific Sea. And this causes flopping of the rainfall in India. And this has been proven. So if you read the documentary archives from India, including the logbooks of the British ships, so I consulted many of the logbooks of the British ships that were moving in the 17th century, because each of these ships were supposed to maintain the logbooks. Now, if you read all these documents, they would suggest that the monsoon was very irregular between this period 1550 to roughly 1690s. So the drought occurrence was much, much higher during these years. And it is, the evidences suggest that there was possibility of one drought every 3 years. Now, this gradually came down to one drought every 6 years in the second half of the 17th century. But these, in the second half of the 17th century, the change that we've observed is that these droughts are continuous for 2 years. So, if there is a drought taking place in one particular year, it continues in the second year. And this frequency of double droughts is actually happening so much in the second half of the 17th century. Now, this means that during this period of the second half of the 17th century, there were frequent El Nino phenomena, meaning that the Indian monsoon was very much affected. Now, on the basis of the empirical data of this kind of frequency of, droughts or the rain failures in the second half of the 17th century, it may be argued that this might have affected the harvest in a big way. And this, in turn, must have affected the state in terms of revenue. So if we are to believe the Mughal documentary accounts, it gives a different and contrary picture. For instance, if you read the Mughal Emperor Shahjahan's account, who ruled from 1627 to 58, it gives a different picture altogether. It says that the Mughal Empire was actually prospering during those days. Now, and it is true also because of the fact that he could not have undertaken huge construction projects if he did not have such huge revenue, such as the Taj Mahal, the Lal Killa that he constructed, the Shah Jahan Baad that he built, so the Jama Masjid that he constructed. Now, this was not possible without huge revenue at his disposal. So, in fact, Shah Jahan built, when he built this Shahjahanabad, the new capital city, it was arguably the only capital city in the world in the mid-17th century. In fact, many of the accounts of the time mention that not only the Mughal documents, even the travelers who have come to during the reign of Shah Jahan, they also mention that this empire was such a huge empire with with a huge length in terms of territory. Now, when they talk about these huge territories, they say that it had actually given them huge amount of income in terms of agricultural revenue, the land revenue. Now, one of the travelers of the time is, which I happened to consult, was Ovington. And he wrote that at that time, in the middle of the 17th century, the Mughals had almost ruled an area which was half the size of Europe. So one of the added advantage for the Mughals was that it had a huge, the area which they controlled had huge peasant population, which lived in a huge fertile plain. So the fertile land that they possessed. Now that extended from Indus to the Ganga basin down to Bengal. So even the Mughal accounts, if you try to look at the Mughal accounts, they glorify the huge extent of the Mughal Empire. But we have to take such descriptions with a pinch of salt. Why I'm saying this? Because many recent writings have been influenced by such documentary evidences. And one of the books which has become very popular in terms of global history is Victor Lieberman's Strange Parallels. So he uses two phrases in that book. He calls this as protected zones and the exposed zones. And he kept the European countries of Southeast Asia in the category of the protected zone, whereas South Asia, India in particular, he puts it in the category of exposed zone category. So it's an exposed zone according to him. Now, they have been called so because why Indian territory has been called an exposed zone, because he says that there was a vast stretch of Indo-Gangetic plain which was easy easy to invade by the Mongols, whose main strength lay in the cavalry. Now, this is a simplistic explanation that he has given why the entire stretch of the Indo-Gangetic zone is an exposed area. I have mentioned elsewhere that why this kind of a sweeping generalization for the entire Indo-Gangetic plain by Victor Lieberman is not correct. But looking at the geography, let me tell you, of this entire stretch of land of the Indo-Gangetic area, which the Mughals had actually possessed, we actually cannot lump the entire land into one category. There were geographical obstructions. There were rivers all around. If you look at the Middle Ganga basin, this entire region has many rivers all around. So this did not allow the Mughal rulers to have a firmer control over the region. Now, having said that, it cannot be denied that the Mughals did not have a huge area under their control for revenue collection. And the most interesting aspect is that the 17th century, the three rulers of the 17th century, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, the names that they choose, these were all imbued with absolute power. Look at the look at the titles that they have. Jahangir means he's the conqueror of the world. Shah Jahan, he's the king of the world. Aurangzeb. So, and then Aurangzeb, he has taken, mind you, the title of Alamgir when he has taken the accession. So Alamgir means he's a world conqueror. Now, the point I'm trying to make with these titles that all these three Mughal emperors have taken in the 17th century, that all these Mughal rulers had to maintain a huge military to lionize their image as world conquerors. And this was not possible without invading far-off territories when you are faced with climate challenges. Now, it is for this very nature of the Mughal rule that they were also able to have huge revenue resources at their disposal in the 17th century. Now, obviously, the shortening of the monsoon period benefited the Mughals, and all the three Mughal emperors went on campaigns every year. They would, if you read the Mughal document, they would say it would suggest that they will proceed after the southwest monsoon had receded, and they would return to the capital ahead of the onset of the annual monsoon. So, the radius of their travel is also very calculated, because the Mughals travel all the time with all their paraphernalia and with their, the entire courts. So they have to, they cannot move more than 4 or 5 maybe miles a day. So this was something that the Mughals actually had continued in the 17th century. So looking at this practically, the kind of movement that the Mughals had in the 17th century, we can see that it was very essential at that time for the Mughal rulers to travel to these far-off areas and control these territories and bring revenue from those areas. Now, having said that, we also need to look at the period of Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb also from the point of view of the frequent monsoon failures that we just mentioned, that there were frequent El Nino phenomena during that period. Now, obviously, I'm still working on this, but I'm still looking for some evidences to suggest that whether there were frequent rain failures. But there are many Mughal accounts which suggest about these. So there were failures of rainfalls in 1630s. There was a continuous failure from 1630 to 32. Then similarly, from 1658 to 60, there were continuous failures for 2 years. And again, it happened in 1685 and 87. Now, all these failures produced widespread famine, and this has been well documented in the Mughal accounts. So, and the most affected area during those days, because of the failure of the monsoon, were the western parts of India, particularly Gujarat, and also huge part of the Ganga plain. Now, mind you, the Ganga plain is one area from where huge amount of revenue came for the Mughals. Now, one of the worst catastrophes that has been well documented happened in 1630s, which continued even in 31 and 32. And there was virtually no rain that had taken place. And it has now been established with the logbooks that, this year actually is a period when there are El Nino phenomena taking place in the Pacific Ocean. So 30 to 32 is a period when El Nino phenomena is taking place, and it is also a period of rain failures, which has been well documented in the Mughal accounts and many of the travelers' accounts also. So like Peter Mundy had talked about the death of huge number of population because of the famine that had taken place. Now, obviously, for rulers like Shah Jahan, when they face with these kind of disasters, these kind of challenges, the climate-induced challenges, they respond to the disaster because he is the ruler. So he has taken a series of measures when famine has taken place. He establishes the soup kitchen, the alms houses, and this has been recorded in the Mughal documents. So because he fully understood possibly that these peasants who are not able to cultivate their land, They are the backbone of the revenue when the good monsoon years would come back. So, but then the question arises that despite this, the huge expenditure on the famine relief, how was it possible for Shah Jahan to spend huge amount of money on his glorification? When I'm saying glorification, I'm talking about the amount of money he has spent on the peacock throne, the amount of money that he has spent on the construction of Taj Mahal, or for that matter, even the Shalimar Garden at Lahore. Now, all these huge expenses were not possible without the invasion to new territories. If you read Abdul Hamid Lahori's, he has in fact devoted well over half of its pages and images about the campaigns of Shah Jahan forces. So Shah Jahan, as you know, he was able to seize Kandahar. He went to Afghanistan. He crossed the Khyber Pass. He failed in the Balkh region, but the Balkh region of Afghanistan. But there are evidences which suggest that he failed there because there were severe winters in that part of Afghanistan. There were huge snowfalls happening in the 1640s, and it reduced his campaign season. So, and it also affected his, the quantity of supplies that he needed for the bulk campaigns. Now, when Aurangzeb became the ruler, there was another very, continuous famines from 1658 to 60, and there were failures of monsoons. Even the prices increased in these regions of not only in Delhi but also in different other parts of India. So Aurangzeb is also one ruler who is said to have abolished many of the taxes, in order to give relief measures to the hardship faced by the people. Nevertheless, the fact remains that the state has been faced by these challenges of climate, and there has been rainfall failures, so the treasury of the state would be affected. In fact, if you read the sources of the time, it would suggest that the revenue for Aurangzeb treasury fell by almost 20% during these continuous famines from 1658 to 1660. In fact, I was reading Shireen Muzvi, and she has argued that the crisis of the 1658 60 period was sort of a watershed for the Mughal expansion and the decline that has happened in the 18th century. Now, but when he's faced, even ruler like Aurangzeb is faced with these challenges, he has to enhance its revenue to sustain the empire. So Aurangzeb too follows a policy of expansion of the Mughal territory. He conquers Deccan, he conquers Bijapur, Golconda. He has remained in fact campaigning in Marathwada region for many years. I think 25 years continuously in that part of India. Now all this is happening because the rulers have now to enhance their revenue. So what I'm suggesting that when these rulers, the Mughal rulers, are faced with the challenges of climate, they take different other measures. They have this leverage because of their huge army to expand to different other territories, and that is the kind of measure that they were forced to take in order to enhance their revenue when they are faced with the challenges. Now, the hypothesis that I have presented before you is still, as I mentioned, is still work in progress. But it is probable that Maunder minimum and the changes in climate had some, but not very similar impact on India. If you contrast it with the European situation during the same 17th century, the it has a thrive. So if you read the accounts of the Mughals, you will find the Mughal treasury has increased during the same period. And it is considered to be most prosperous of the Mughal in Mughal history. So the two rulers, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, are considered to be the period when you have the magnificence of the Mughal Empire taking place. So you have the construction of huge monuments taking place. Now, I'm still trying to pull together more kind of natural and archival data to understand the real impact that the Indian monsoon had in this long 17th century. But I'm surprised that for early modern period of history, why we have confined ourselves to the conventional sources. Now, this despite the fact that much of the materials, such as as I mentioned, the sailing ships and the logbooks that they maintain, they have been around for centuries, and yet, what we see that the historians have not used such sources to write the history of 17th century. Now, these logs include very interesting data. If you read these logs, you will find that they mention about the tide, they mention about the winds, they mention about the ocean currents, they mention about the climate and the weather. Now, which is ultimately actually affecting the monsoon patterns of the mainland in India. So how is it possible that you are setting aside all these important informations of the 17th century and explaining the 17th century without considering such sources? So as I mentioned, we have two categories of sources that you have the natural archives and you have the human archives. So the documentary archives that we talk about are basically human archives. So in human archive category itself, you have these logbooks, the logs maintained by the ships. But then you also have very interesting natural archives, and the information of this has been given by the scientists. We have data for the last 1,000 years now from the scientists to suggest that what kind of tree rings activities have taken place. Now, the tree ring activity is actually connected to the rainfalls. So even for India, we have these informations about the tree rings for the last 1,000 years. We have information about the ice cores, the marine sediments. All these informations can be can be used by the historians to do their analysis, to do their interpretations for the 17th century. Not only 17th century, many other centuries. Now, now this is so relevant because the case of India is very important in the 17th century because in 17th century, many of the European ships have been traveling in the Indian Oceans. So overall, what I am trying to emphasize and what I have suggested you is that if we want to understand the early modern period in a better way or more holistically, we need to consider climate as well as other kind of sources that I just mentioned as important components. We have to consider these sources. We have to consider these informations related to climate to do our analysis. And when I say so, it has certain internal logic, because my logic revolves around the conviction that the Mughal historiography has not been able to present the true and the complete picture. So I stop here now. Thank you so much for listening to me. Now, Ujjwal, you can take over. Hello, Ujjwal.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, sir, for the interesting lecture. It was really interesting and fascinating. Now, moving on to the Q&A session. Does anyone has any question for sir? They can raise their hands in the Google Meet. Anyone?
5 minutes more. 5 minutes.
Okay, Inesh, you can unmute yourself and can ask the question directly to the sir.
Good afternoon, sir. I had a question.
Yes, go
Uh,
ahead, please.
okay, sir, thank you. So, what I uh, what I've observed from the 17th century crisis, which is generalized in India and has been extended to India, not only on terms of environment but also on political and on the social changes and the drastic changes which is occurring during that period. So, with regards to that, uh, we also see that by the time 17th century ends in 1707, the Mughal Empire declines drastically. So, can we make any connection that how did this? What is the overall legacy of these global anomalies in the Mughal in the Mughal rule, and how did it subsequently develop in the later stages? Was the Mughal Empire was completely able to respond to the crisis it was going through, or did it leave some uh, mark which developed into a crisis later on?
Uh, Good question. In fact, I'm still working on that idea, but at present, what I can suggest is that, and this is my present hypothesis, it may change later on based on the evidences that I find. But my present hypothesis is that when you are faced with such crisis, and then you respond to the such crisis by invading different territories, it's not sustainable. So the more sustainable way is that was followed by Akbar, who had created huge bureaucratic structure, and he had created a bureaucratic structure which was sustainable. So there were changes introduced in those bureaucratic structure even by Shah Jahan, by Jahangir also. But then when you are faced with these challenges, now the challenges are not challenges which has remained confined to 1 or 2 years. It had become a usual phenomena. Now, another evidence that I forgot to mention that I found in many of the logbooks account is that the shortening of the Indian monsoon months. Now, this is happening in the 17th century. Now, shortening of the Indian monsoon months is something which is very significant, because when the length of the monsoon months gets shortened, that means it will also affect the agriculture. So obviously the response that the Mughals, when they are faced with such kind of challenges, and the response that came from the Mughals was obviously the most easiest one, invading new territories. But obviously it was not sustainable, and that might have led to the crisis that we see in the 18th century. Yes, next. Ujjwal?
Thank you, sir. Sir, I think Sir Ujjwal left. He might have a network issue. So, on his behalf, I will be conducting the Q&A session. So, does any professor wants to ask a question, or a student, they can raise their hand, and we'll take question. So, feel free to ask a question. Mm. I think, sir, the lecture was quite interesting, and it is a very new topic which none of us has ever, in our, at least especially in our undergraduation, we have touched the environmental aspect of history in a very minute sense. Okay, so I see, Mansi, you have a question. You may unmute yourself and ask.
Hello, sir. Thank you
Uh,
for the lecture.
wait, wait,
I,
wait. Mansi,
oh,
Vipul Singh has left.
yeah. Oh, okay, okay. I'll wait.
Should be some network issue. Let us wait for a few moments.
Welcome back, sir. Mansi, you may ask the question.
All right. So my question was that, sir, as sir mentioned that the Mughals responded enormously by invading new territories to the changing environment. So I was wondering how did that affect the invaded territories, and like what kind of impact did it have to the new territories in terms of revenue extraction, and like um, how did it affect those territories? Yes.
Sir, you are muted. Sir, so please unmute yourself. Yes, thank you,
Okay.
sir.
So when the invasions take place, there are two things happening. You would either take control of the territory and appoint your rulers, governors there. That's one way of doing it. The other way is that you attack the territory, invade the territory, collect the revenue, and come back. So that is something which is for different parts of India. Different things are happening. For example, Aurangzeb was trying to take control of Marathwada region, but he's faced by challenges by the rise of the Maratha power at that time. So it's not easy for a ruler like Aurangzeb to have a sustainable revenue from the Marathwada region. So different regions like Bijapur and Golconda, they were controlled. Initially, they were able to collect revenue from those areas, but later on under Aurangzeb's period, it was not easy for the ruler to take control of the region and collect the revenue from the same regions. And also, it is also essential for us to realize that these are not the regions which are not affected by climate. These are also the regions which have been affected by climate. For example, when I say that there is an attempt by Aurangzeb to take control of the Marathwada region, the fact is that Aurangzeb wanted to take control of the Marathwada region also because that part of India was not that much affected by the Indian failure of the Indian monsoon. So as I mentioned, that the western part of India, like Gujarat, Rajasthan, Delhi, even up to Delhi, there were massive rainfall failures. There are failures even in the Indo-Gangetic fields, the lands that the Indo-Gangetic lands that we have. But this part of Maharashtra, the Marathwada region, did not face those challenges or continue. So there were no continuous rainfall failures for many years. So that's something which Aurangzeb might have had in his mind, and that's why he was so particular about taking control of the Marathwada region. So these what I'm suggesting is that for different regions it could have different implications for the when we talk about the invasion.
Thank you, sir. Uh, we'll take one last question before ending the lecture. I see Mayank. Mayank, sir, you have a question. You may unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you, Saurav. And good to see you, Vipul. How are
Thank you.
you?
Fine.
Mubarak ho. Now, very interesting, very provocative, and very controversial. So it will take time to digest. and let's work together to develop this. But let me share few of my observations so that students will have a matlab they can plan their own questions and they can plan their own thinking on those lines. If you're suggesting that invasion was a way to mitigate or to address the climate variability, I'll not term this as a climate change, I'll term it as a climate variability, then expansion of Mughal Empire from Akbar is also an expansion. Was it due to the climate variability? Coming of Babur to India is also part of climate variability. Expansion of empire under Nandas or Maurya can be termed as that as in response to the climate variability. If that is the so, then we need to be very careful while generalizing. The second thing, which is later on you have very rightly pointed out, the landscape diversity of Indian subcontinent. And that is what students must realize, that it's not only climate which is very important, it is the landscape which plays very important role. The similar kind of weather conditions in a different kind of geographical locations will play very different role. Monsoon in Rajasthan, failure of monsoon in Rajasthan and failure of monsoon in Indo-Gangetic plain will have a very different connotation. So we need to broaden this research. I totally agree with you. And I'm afraid, and I have been sharing this thought with at other forums as well, that for some reason in India, we have not developed collaborative research. And this requires for collaborative research, especially the way you have been mentioning about the logbooks. We have not used that. We need to bring all those sources. And perhaps, I'm afraid, but I'm convinced that no one single person can do that. So it's a good initiative, Vipul. Let's work it out and point out the nuances and the caveats. Only then perhaps we will be able to develop this formulation. But at the moment, we have several reservations. We'll work on that. We'll discuss that later on. Thanks,
Thank
Vipul.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we'll wrap the lecture here. For those who have further questions, you can email us at our email ID, Instagram, and Facebook. Sir, can we take one last question, or do you want to?
I think we should stop now. It's already
Okay.
1:50.
Okay, yes, sir, I agree. Okay, then, thank you, sir, for the lecture. The Department of History, Delhi College of Arts and Commerce is grateful, and we hope to see you for further lecture. And it would be exciting to read your new book and work. Thank you.
Thank you so
I
much.
think you can disconnect now.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting.